sleeps before polling day for the general election, and it is your chance to put your questions to the man who's confident that he already knows the outcome.
I think it's very clear from the polling information in England that the Conservatives are going to lose the election in England and there will be a Labour government on Friday.
Well, that's First Minister John Swinney, and he is here to take your calls. The lines are open now, 08085 92 95 00. You can also use that number to WhatsApp message or leave a voice note. Here it is again, 08085 92 95 00. I see William, Jeffrey and Kaye all lined up, ready to put their question to John Swinney. Last week, the leaders of the Scottish Conservatives, Scottish Labour and the Scottish Liberal Democrats were here to take your calls. Now, as we approach polling day, it is the leader of the SNP. You can also text on 80295. As ever, we've got lots more coming up after 10, but we have Mr Swinney for just half an hour, so we will crack on. The number again, 08085 92 95 00.
Your calls, your stories.
Mornings with Kaye Adams on BBC Radio Scotland.
Listen on BBC Sounds.
And just to say, we also have Andrew Kerr, BBC Scotland's political correspondent, with us as well. Good morning to you, Andrew.
Good morning.
Good morning. As I say, Mr Swinney has got half an hour with us. We invited all of our leaders to take an hour on the phone in, and because of busy schedules, it's been slightly different. So we've got half an hour with Mr Swinney, so we can talk afterwards, Andrew, and take calls on people's thoughts. But for now, good morning, Mr Swinney.
Good morning, Kaye.
Good morning, and I appreciate your time this morning. We used that clip at the beginning there, and you have been drumming home this message that Labour are going to win convincingly across the rest of the UK, certainly England, and therefore Scots should vote SNP to protect their interest. What are you basing that sense of conviction of a Labour victory on?
Well, I think every single poll there has been for some considerable time has shown an enormous lead for the Labour Party in the rest of the United Kingdom, and that by it's kind of margin of 40 to 20 against the Conservatives across the United Kingdom. Here in Scotland, however, there's a hotly contested election between the Labour Party and the SNP. And
well, you say that, Mr Swinney, we're very wary about going off polls at the BBC, but numerous polls over a number of weeks have been suggesting that the SNP stands to lose a substantial number of seats in this election. But also, interestingly, if we're looking at polls, that support for independence is holding at 50-50. So what does that tell you about what people think about the SNP's record?
Well, what it means is that the SNP's got work to do to command the support of people who support independence. And what I would say to people who want Scotland to be an independent country is that it'll not come about by voting for any other party than the SNP.
I'm stating the obvious, but you've been in power for 17 years.
Well, and I'm kind of stating.
So what more work is there to do?
And I'm kind of stating the obvious back to UK that if anybody wants independence and they want independence to come about,
no, but what the polls are saying is 50-50 do want independence, but going off the polls, which you're so convinced by in terms of a Labour victory being a sure thing, you're going to lose a load of seats.
Well, I'm simply saying.
So maybe they don't think you're the person to deliver independence.
Well, I've been in office for 8 weeks, and I've been strengthening the SNP's opinion poll position since I came into office, and I'm simply saying to voters who want Scotland to be independent that it won't come about by any other mechanism than giving a resounding vote to the Scottish National Party, and that's how we'll get independence, by the SNP being strong and able to give the political leadership to the delivery of independence within Scotland.
And what about the 50% of people, and again we're going on polls, which we really shouldn't, we have to be careful, but you kind of said that you do have faith in the polls. And I know a lot of people have tackled you on this, and they've said to you, you have said, well, if you get a majority of seats in this election, the Scottish seats, then that will be a mandate for independence. And then you have been questioned on that. Well, what if you don't? Does that mean that people don't want independence? And you've said, well, no, we go back to the 2021 mandate, so we won't rehearse that again. But what do people have to do to tell you that they don't want independence? Because you have been accused of, heads you win, tails you lose.
Well, what I think people should have the choice to do is to decide whether they want Scotland to be an independent country. And in 2021, we were told to go away and get a parliamentary majority in favour of an independence referendum if we wanted to demonstrate support for independence. And we went away and we got that. And that parliamentary majority exists today. And I simply want it to be respected so that the people of Scotland who elected the Scottish Parliament in 2021 gave it a majority in support of a referendum on independence should have the opportunity to now see that delivered.
So
now,
if you lose a stack of seats,
of
seats in this general election coming up on Thursday, it means nothing about independence.
Well, what it means is that I want the democratic views of the people of Scotland to be
But it means nothing.
To.
So the result
and
on Thursday means nothing about independence.
Well, wait a minute, Kaye. We're not going to get very far if we're just, if you're just interrupting me all the time.
Well, that's all these leaders' debates I've seen. That seems to be the way to do it.
Well, I think it's pretty purposeless, to be honest. I don't think the public like it. I think the public are fed up with the constant interruptions. So let me just set out my view. You asked me a question, which was, how do people express their view about independence? And I think they should express that in a referendum, because if I go back to 2014, we were told if you vote no in the referendum, you'll be protecting your EU membership. We're out of the EU against our wishes. That's a big change in our circumstances. And I think people in Scotland should be able to exercise their view on the question of independence in an open referendum. And that's always been my view.
OK. Well, as I say, this is about our listeners putting their questions to you, and we've got a load stacked up. Let me remind you of the numbers: 08 085 92 95 00, and you can also use that to WhatsApp message or indeed leave a voice note. William, good morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning, John.
Morning, William.
Just put your question to Mr. Swinney, William.
OK. Mr. Swinney, I think Scotland is a great country, and I'm sure you would agree with that. But I think we're going through a challenging time, and you probably also agree with that as well. But I also feel that we're a divided country, and part of that is due to political noise. And I'm a bit fed up with the noise of politicians who endlessly debate issues that are a priority for the few, but not the many. I also feel we're in a divided country.
Could you give an example, William, of what you're talking about?
But I think the priorities for politicians are things like gender ideology, net zero, but the priorities for people are the bread and butter: education, health, as well as even immigration. So I also, as I was saying there, Kay, I feel that the world has changed, and that's because of how we've consumed information. We're consuming it differently now. I'm a member of multiple groups on Telegram. I use X. I follow different people. And while I align with you, John, on certain things, on the idea of independence, but not your particular flavour, I don't align with your worldview on a number of issues. And I actually voted for Brexit, and I would vote for Brexit again. And while there was 1.7 million people who voted to remain in Scotland, there was over 1 million who voted for Brexit. Okay. And so my message to you, and my question is, how are you going to engage with people like me who don't see the world as you see the world? Because I feel demonised with how politicians express themselves in the public discourse, and I feel there must be a better way for us to get to the truth and get along with each other, because at the end of the day, we're all Scottish, John, and we really should do better, I feel. OK. All right, Mr. Swinney.
Yeah, well, thanks, William. And I actually understand entirely where you're coming from. When I became First Minister, I said that one of my priorities was to try to improve political discourse in Scotland, because I completely agree with you. I think political discourse is now poor, and I was quite open in my acceptance speech in Parliament to acknowledge my contribution to making that political discourse poor, and I have to change that, and I'm going about trying to do that. Part of that is a wee bit challenging, because 2 weeks into my period as First Minister, I've been thrown into an election campaign. Election campaigns are pretty contested spaces, but once I get past this, I want to try to reach out to build an awful lot more agreement in Scotland, to focus on what I think are the big priorities for Scotland. So I set out that there's 4 big themes that will dominate my leadership: eradicating child poverty, stimulating economic growth, improving our public services, and this is perhaps where we part company, successfully delivering the journey to net zero, because we can't escape the climate emergency, William. All the data is staring us in the face. So I want to try to bring people together around about that agenda. Now, I've obviously got a particular view on the Constitution, but I want to avoid that being an impediment to us trying to make some progress on some of these big issues.
The other couple of issues that William mentioned there that doesn't really speak to him was gender ideology, and I know you were questioned on that on Radio 5 Live yesterday. You were asked the question, how many genders are there? And there's been quite a bit of comment as to the hesitation that you had in answering that. I don't know if you're kind of clearer on it now.
Well, there's there are various people take various views about the number of genders that there are, but for me, Parliament passed the gender recognition legislation. The United Kingdom government decided to challenge that, to use their powers to challenge that. It was addressed by the courts, and the courts viewed that the UK government was entitled to do what it did. So your answer is what? Well, I gave the answer yesterday that there were two genders, but I recognise there are people that take a different view to that. Right, but in your view there are two genders? Yeah.
OK. Lynn has asked, will you and your party support single-sex services and sports for women and girls?
Well, on the question of single-sex spaces, all the provision for that is provided within the equality legislation of 2010, and I want to make sure that the appropriate provisions are put in place to do so. OK.
Some people might not be familiar with that legislation. I mean, it's a pretty straight question from Lynn. Will you and your party support single-sex services and sports for women and girls?
I think, well, the sporting issue, I think, is an issue for the sporting bodies. I don't think government legislates.
So you don't have a view on that?
Well, I don't. I think it's for the sporting bodies to discuss that, and I don't think I should be lecturing the sporting bodies about their regulation. But in relation to the safety of women and girls, which is the responsibility of government, the legislation is very clear that single-sex spaces are permissible to enable the protection of women and girls to be applied, and I want to make sure there's no doubt or dubiety about that question.
Permissible. There is dubiety in that word, permissible. Permissible or enforceable or mandatory. Where are we?
Well, enforceable. Enforceable is absolutely. Right. Sorry if forgive me if my language is not absolutely correct on that, but enforceable is certainly my view, because that's the law, and it's the law in the Equality Act.
Thank you for that clarity. Let's get through as many calls as we can. Kate is in Cumnock. Good morning, Kate.
Morning.
Morning. Are you through to Mr. Swinney?
Morning, Mr. Swinney.
Morning, Kate.
Hi. So it's a very personal point I'm making this morning. I've been on this programme a few times on behalf of my son, who has complex special needs, and I've been a carer for 46 years. Today, I no longer become a recognised carer. Today, I become an old age pensioner. So my carer's allowance goes, and I step into state pension, which is fine. I've known that was coming. But Nicola Sturgeon, a lot of years ago now, stood up and gave a fabulous speech about how much she supported the carers and how the country couldn't stand without them, and she valued them so much that she gave us a top-up payment twice a year, just to recognise the job that we do. But as of today, I no longer am valued. I don't get the carers allowance, that's fine, I've accepted that. But to be valued yesterday as a carer and not today kind of sticks in my throat a little bit. I've had 46 years of caring. It doesn't get easier. I get older, my son gets older, and now we're not valued. I don't see why, if you value us so much, that you could not continue that top-up payment. For a lot of women I'm familiar with, are in the same position. Life gets harder, tougher, care, wear and tear, but we get no recognition after we're 66.
Right. Well, first of all, Kate, happy birthday. And
thank you.
I hope, I know every day will be a tough day for you with what you're doing, but I do hope that you can have a nice time today. So happy birthday. Mm-hmm. In relation to your point, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I'm sorry that you feel that yesterday you were valued and today you're not valued. I'm sorry that you feel that way, and I wouldn't want you to feel that way. And I can only.
I can't see any other way of viewing it.
I can understand what you're saying. I think the answer to your point will be in the interaction between the rules on pensions and the rules on carer support. And I don't have a precise answer for you.
I can give you that precise answer. My husband and I both become pensioners this summer. Lovely. We don't qualify for pension credit. That's good.
Right, okay.
We have a comfortable pension. Right. Not just a state pension, no private pensions. I have been unable to work all the years that I've supported Michael. But because of that, although I have an underlying carer's entitlement, doesn't give me any cash, that's fine. We'll manage on our state pension. But it's the principle here.
Yeah.
It's the absolute principle that Nicola valued us so much that, well done SNP. Michael has been an SNP supporter for years. Every time Nicola was in the paper, I had to cut out her image, pin it in the wall. She was his pin-up girl. He would be very, very disappointed if he was fully aware, which he's not, of the position now for his mum and lots of other carers.
I think the issue, Kate, is that essentially what happens when you go into the pension system, you go into a set of rules that will be governed by your eligibility for other benefits as a consequence of getting your pension. That then, I think, drives the eligibility for carer support. But I'm going to take that issue away and just satisfy myself there's not something that we could do to try to address the point that you're making. But I think it's on the basis of the fact that your pension will essentially be the definition of what is then your eligibility for any other support, and that then knocks you out of eligibility for carer support. But I need to take that, I'm going to take that away, and if you wouldn't mind, Kate, sending me an email, or if the programme could send that to me, I will explore that to see if there's anything else we could do to try to protect the situation that you're putting to me.
Okay. Well, thank you for that, and we can certainly pick that up off air. We will do that. But let me now come to Katrina in Falkirk, because I think she also wants to talk about welfare spend. Morning to you, Katrina.
Good morning.
Good morning. What's your question to Mr Swinney?
Good morning, First Minister.
Morning, Katrina.
I want to speak regarding welfare. The Scottish Government currently just now have devolved powers over only 14% of welfare spend in Scotland. And with those powers, they've managed to create new benefits in Scotland. And they've also managed to create Social Security Scotland. So my question is, should the new government at Westminster be considering devolving full welfare powers to Scotland?
I certainly would encourage them to do so, because what we've tried to do is to make a difference with our support on social security. One of the benefits that we've introduced has been the Scottish Child Payment, which makes payments directly into households where there's children in low-income households, and they get a payment of £26.70 a week now. We increased that significantly from the original proposition, which was £5 a week, and we are now seeing that child poverty in Scotland, we're keeping 100,000 children out of poverty in Scotland as a consequence of measures such as the Scottish Child Payment.
What would you do if you had all welfare powers? What would you do? I mean, would you perhaps be able to help our last caller?
Well, that's obviously, because actually I think part of the answer to Kate's question, the last caller, is the interaction between pension eligibility and carers eligibility. So the pensions rules kind of trump the rules on carers allowance. So there are obviously opportunities to create a more integrated system, and then also to put the financial support directly to households which make a difference to them, which is what we're seeing with the Scottish Child Payment.
So what would you do with all welfare powers?
Well, what we do is make sure that we most effectively met the needs of individuals and focused our support. And the Scottish Child Payment is one example of how we would do that. There is obviously particular issues in relation to the eligibility for work support, which we think we've got to encourage more people to get into employment, to support them to do so. There's some opportunities in flexible childcare, which also have an interaction with the benefit system, which are important to take forward, so we can create a holistic approach to supporting people into employment where they're facing poverty.
OK, all right. We've got, let me remind people of the number, though we do have lots of calls stacked up, but please do take up the opportunity to speak directly to Mr Swinney. 08085 92 95 00. You can text 80295. We've got Margaret on the line. Morning, Margaret.
Morning.
Good morning. What would you like to ask Mr Swinney?
What I would like to say to Mr Swinney and ask his opinion is that the very, very best thing we can do for our children and our young people is to give them a first-class education. Now, when people mention things like that, the government always say, oh, well, they've not got money, and they blame the UK for not giving them enough money. Well, I would like Mr Swinney to answer why he has spent so much money in opening embassies in Europe instead of retaining school teachers, why they delayed the censor and it cost 20 million, why we're employing double the civil servants and spin doctors, the money we're wasting on ferries, bottle recycle, which we're going to be sued for. It's just one thing after another that the Scottish Government seem to be able to spend millions and millions of pounds, blame the UK Government, and yet our education system has gone down the drain, which is the very, very best thing that can lift people and give them a chance out of poverty. Not handouts, give them a definite first-class education. Why can't Scotland do that?
Just before you answer that, can I tag on to the end of that a text that's come in saying, I would like to ask Mr Swinney what he plans to do in regards to education, especially violence and aggression towards staff, so you can deal with all of those.
Okie doke. On the... First of all, I don't agree, Margaret, that with how you characterise the Scottish education system. I don't think the evidence bears that out. We had last year the highest number of National 5 passes in our education system. We've got the highest number of young people leaving the education system going into training, education or work or university than we've ever had in our history.
So you're happy with the quality of education in Scotland at the moment?
I think we should always be concentrating on improvement in education, but I don't agree with the characterisation of education that Margaret put to me. I don't agree with that at all.
Margaret, does that surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me because you just don't recognise what they're doing and the direction they're going in. Sir Tom Hunter was on the television the other day and he had generated a system in where secondary school teachers were getting sent to an academy he sent up to make sure they were getting first-class training. And everything was going fine with that when Mr Swinney was the Education Secretary. But the minute he left, Mr Hunter said he got a 2-paragraph letter saying the Scottish Government had no more money to support it. That's how much they think of Scottish education.
Okay. Well, the scheme that Sir Tom refers to is Columba 1400, which the government funded significantly for pardon?
It's now stopped it. And Mr Hunter, yesterday on the telly, he said, I want to tell the Scottish Government that I will fund it myself because I think education is so important.
Yeah,
but obviously the Scottish Government doesn't.
Well, the government funds education very significantly, and one of the things we've done, for example, is we've doubled the provision of early learning and childcare so that children get the best start in life for all 3- and 4-year-olds and some 2-year-olds. Now, we've doubled that since we came into office. It's the best early learning and childcare offering anywhere in the United Kingdom. And as I indicated, we have very good outcomes been achieved by young people going into university or training or work at very high levels and higher than when we came into office.
What about the specific question about violence and aggression towards staff, which is a recognised issue, isn't it? It has been recognised by Jenny Gilruth, and we were expecting some kind of report on that, which I think has been delayed. How concerned are you about that? Or do you think that's overblown?
No, I am concerned about that, and we have been doing good work with the education system about how best to intervene to address these issues, to de-escalate situations within schools and to create the appropriate culture whereby there should be no violence within our schools.
So what's going to change?
Well, what's going to change is there'll be a lot of emphasis on early intervention and early action to make sure that schools are places that are safe for young people at all times.
But what would that intervention be?
Well, what that involves is essentially programmes of education within our schools so that we are putting an emphasis on creating that culture where violence is not an acceptable part of behaviour within our schools, and to support schools to take the necessary measures to do that. Now, that's complex work involving our teaching associations, our local authorities and young people themselves, and that work will be undertaken. The report you're talking about... So
you don't think there's got anything to do with the structure of Scottish education, about the number of young people with additional learning needs, which I think is around a third in classes, about the teachers, the number of teachers? You don't think there's anything to do with that? It's an education piece, is it, to educate young people that violence isn't good?
There will always be questions about resources, but, I have to live within the resources that are available to me as First Minister, and as I've said throughout this election campaign, campaign. There is absolutely ferocious pressure on public expenditure. It's why I've made such an issue about the need for austerity to come to an end. And it has to come to an end because the type of measures that you're talking about to me, or the measures that we've taken to expand early learning and childcare, they cost significant amounts of public expenditure. And I don't think we can cope with any more of the austerity that we've had for 14 years.
All right.
And unfortunately,
but we're not going to go down that line because we want people to have the opportunity to speak to you, Mr. Swinney, and talk to you about your policies. So let's move on. We've got Jane. Good morning, Jane.
Good morning.
Are you through to Mr. Swinney, Jane?
Morning, Jane.
Oh, good morning, John. Yes, I'm interested really in hearing some definite confirmation of a commitment by you and the SNP to protect women's rights and protect women's single-sex spaces. I'm concerned, listening to what you were saying earlier about the Equality Act. To be honest, I think you've been quite disingenuous in claiming that the Equality Act gives protections for single-sex spaces, which it does, but unfortunately that's being ignored. So how do you explain then, if we have the protections that we already need, how do you explain after a damning employment tribunal judgment around Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre, we still have a male running that centre telling women who've been raped that if they're not willing to accept a male identifying as a female, providing their services and support, that they're the ones that need to reframe their trauma. How do you explain a Fife health worker currently taking Fife Health Board to an employment tribunal after she was forced to use a changing room alongside a male who was identifying as a female? These are exemptions allowed for within the Equality Act, but they're not being they're not happening. So women are being disadvantaged. Their safety, their privacy, their dignity is being put at risk.
Okay, Jane, let Mr. Swinney respond.
Thanks, Jane. I understand the significance and the seriousness of these issues, and I've seen some information on the two cases that you have referred to. My understanding on the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre issue is that they are essentially reviewing their whole handling of that issue to determine whether, just what the appropriate handling of that. I'm less familiar with the Fife Health Board issue, although I've heard some of the details of that. But fundamentally, I come back to my point, and I think you actually sort of confirmed that point, Jane, that the legislation does provide for the protection of single-sex spaces. But the crucial point is that it has to be applied and enforced, which is the point I confirmed to Kaye in my earlier answer. Well, that was the difference between
permissible and enforced, wasn't it?
Yeah, and for the avoidance of doubt, my view is that this is the law, so it should be enforced. So I think the protection that Jane is seeking is there. It has to be enforced and applied, and if there are cases where that is not the case, then obviously organisations need to they need to respond to that and to set out how they're going to go about doing that, which is what I think is happening in the cases that have been raised. So are you giving Jane a commitment that you believe that ability to create the single-sex space should be enforced? Yes, and there you go, Jane.
Well, that's all very well, but when those organisations are getting told by the government through policies and directives from the Scottish Government that anyone who identifies as a female is a female, it doesn't really help that enforcing of those single-sex spaces, because if someone's saying, I'm a woman, and the government is saying to organisations, you must accept that person as a woman, we've got self-ID by the back door, and that's what organisations are working on. So it's not good enough, John. It's absolutely not good enough.
Jane, listen, you've made your point very, very plainly there. If you don't mind, we're going to go and we've got time for one more question, and it's on another subject entirely. It's from Cameron, who is in Banff. Good morning, Cameron. Morning, Cameron.
Yes, hello. You caught me unawares there.
Sorry, there you go. You've got the last question to John Swinney.
All right, thank you. John, I'm in agriculture. Farming, fish and food and drink are the biggest sector in the Scottish economy, yet it's hardly had a mention in the whole election campaign. We employ over 250,000 people. I'm just concerned, some of the government has been so desperate to get post-Brexit trade deals done. They've signed up to almost anything, and it's often food and drink. It's the trade-off. What can SNP MPs do to make sure any trade deals don't mean that foodstuffs that are produced standards that would be illegal in this country are allowed to come in, undercutting the home produce? And can you also put pressure on the incoming Labour government to renegotiate Australia and New Zealand trade deals?
Yeah,
we do have to be careful of the incoming Labour government. The poll is on Thursday. We'll find out on Friday what the result is.
The likely incoming Labour government.
Sure.
On your substantive point, Cameron, on agriculture, I was very pleased that we got the agriculture bill through Parliament just a couple of weeks ago, and it was worked on very closely between ourselves and the agriculture sector. And I spent a couple of days at the Royal Highland Show. As you might be familiar, I represent a rural area. I'm very, very closely informed about agriculture issues, and I listen carefully to those involved in the food and drink sector, because I recognise it to be such a fundamental part of our economy. You're absolutely right to be nervous about trade deals and about the danger that we are leaving ourselves in the current UK government's desperation to get trade deals. They have exposed us to a lowering of standards, particularly in relation to the Australian trade deal.
But I think Cameron was asking, can you do anything about it, or you can't?
We've got to apply the political pressure within the House of Commons to make sure that we've got trade deals that recognise the importance of maintaining high food standards, protecting our domestic produce from being undercut by lower quality imports. And we have to apply that political pressure and to make it a big issue to the United Kingdom government. Now, food and drink, as Cameron says, matters very significantly to the Scottish economy. So SNP MPs will attach the priority to that because it really matters to Scotland, because that's what SNP MPs do. They protect Scotland and they argue for the Scottish interest. OK,
Cameron, thank you. Just a final text from Philip. It's a yes-no answer, so it won't take any time. Can you give a yes-no answer, says Philip, on whether you would impose VAT on private education?
Yes.
You would?
I would, yes.
Right, OK. Well, listen, thank you. And just a clarification, Margaret, one of our callers, mentioned the SNP opening embassies. Of course, only the UK government can open embassies, so this, Scotland has not opened embassies in foreign territories. There are international hubs, which are a different thing. So just a point of clarification there before I forget. Mr Swinney, thank you very much for joining us this morning.
Thank you very much, Kate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.